you and I have participated in political movements and leftist spaces. Don't you feel like sometimes you're in a room with like a lot of really fragile eggs who can't deal with actual confrontation or contradiction because if they bump up against each other, they think they're going to crack? That, we need to discuss why left politics has no popular appeal, why it gets absorbed by liberalism, why we're in the situation today. This new communitarianism that was sort of the structure of the internet at the bottom of the California ideology is all about this instantaneous transformation. The thing now that people are rejecting, I think, is that in actuality, democratic forms and capitalism cannot coexist, and capitalism is eating democracy alive.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My returning guest is Catherine Liu, a professor of film and media studies at UC Irvine. She is the author of Hoarders, the case against the professional managerial class. To what do you attribute this emphasis on morality, specifically the word care, among white-collar professionals in the last few years?
So D.W. Winnicott says that when mothers give birth to children and human adults take care of that child, they move into a special state of being where they're vigilant and they have to care for this infant to the detriment often of themselves.
Right.
There's like this unthinking sacrifice and gift giving. We all receive that kind of care or else we would not be alive. I mean, we're born like little mole children, really. We can't move our head. We have no spinal control. Our heads go back this way if they're not supported, which is psychically and physically damaging. And so the holding of an infant is about this kind of intense, vigilant attentiveness that Winnicott says we move out of as the infant becomes more independent. But this intense state of care, I think, is the proper idea of using that term. We translate it, dilute it in the liberal world into caring about animals, caring about earth, caring about art, caring about social justice. But that kind of care is so reduced and so reified in liberal discourse today. And there's something liberating about the right and the Republicans when they're like, we don't care. We don't care about recycling. We don't care about fossil fuels. We care about everyone being able to drive around freely. There's a kind of immersive pleasure in the world that rejects this reduced form of vigilance, this very reduced superficial form of vigilance, very performative kind of moralizing thing that happens within the liberal discourse today. And I've been talking a lot about virtue, right? And it's not real virtue, though, that the white-collar elites hoard. It's this very reduced, reified form of virtue. Like something about Christianity that is really amazing, though, I think I've like OD'd on the imagery, but if you go through the churches of Europe, you'll see this Madonna and Child is such an important duo in Christianity. And part of it is about this realization, physicalization of the care thing, right? And I think that we want to think that the deity and some all-powerful being cares about us. And it's terrifying to think about that indifference. So we become, in our everyday lives, little gods. Now, the thing that caring all the time about things, this liberal ideal, but I think the thing about the right, and I just watched Trump's performance, he plays the child, and the liberals play the caring, powerful, but kind of punitive mother figure. And his childishness is like, let's just enjoy. I'm going to be the circus barker. Let's just have performativity. And there's this kind of transgressive attitude that he has that's very much directed at, this owning the libs. Because the liberal hegemony is like this horrible mother figure who's been oppressing us with her, like, you don't care about your grades? That's, just all of these things about not arriving at care and being sanction for it is a kind of punitive maternal superego thing. So on the one hand, you have the superficial caring, and then on the other hand, you have this owning that's taking place about caring. I think we're trapped in the Thunderdome right now. There's no exit.
You mentioned this latent theme of infantilization. Is there some type of analogy we could draw here between the erosion of lowercase d democracy, this kind of punitive parental figure, and treating individual subjects or participants in democratic society as infants?
There's this essay by Kant called What is Enlightenment? And people don't read it anymore because he talks about how important it is for people to reach maturity, to become citizens of a democracy. And, you can see like all of these hyper-liberal academics who want to decolonize everything just like freaking out about this essay. Like, what? That's so normative. Like, who wants to be mature? Maturity is really like oppressive. And you have to, he's gatekeeping reason. Like, I just, when I read it, I'm just like, I just hear everyone objecting to it now. I'm like, no one's reading it. I love this essay because I value reason. I value rationality. But you can see all these like, we need to decolonize adulthood. We need to decolonize reason. We need to be like, what about feelings and vibes and all this? But this started like in the 80s and 90s when I was in graduate school already. Like people were like, that's so heteropatriarchal normative. That because Foucault actually, my shibboleth, actually wrote a counter essay against Kant. And so you have this idea that maturity is normative, maturity gives you this straight path. People, if you're immature, you can't participate. And so what we've had in this like liberal reaction against the Enlightenment is the sacralization of immaturity and polymorphous perversity, which means that you are just a surface of feelings. Like everyone loved to live for a while, where you're just a surface of feelings and vibes. And if you're like vibing wrong with something, you're having like a non-dialectical relationship with the other, whatever they say. But there's no differentiation. Sorry, I can't stop making fun of them. But there's no differentiation. You're like an egg, and I really feel like a lot of these young people today and living online, you're literally the egg avatar. Like your skin is very fragile.
They literally make memes of this. They call it the body without organs, and it's a character of an egg. Yeah.
This is the delusion thing. But then we have like we have Tumblr and older forms of social media, Instagram now, TikTok, everything else, taking that body without organs and forgetting about it, but using its principles to say that it's better to be this undifferentiated egg-like organism that's just feeling or vibrating with the world. And part of the thing about Freud that I think is really important that nobody wants, everyone thinks is very normative, is human beings are born in a very egg-like way. We're not differentiated. And we psychologically have to learn about our genitals. We have to learn about control of our bodies, literally controlling our spine, but also control of the sphincter, control of all the orifices, in fact. And all the orifices give us so much pleasure. In the beginning, you cry, you get the boob, you poop, it's kind of fun. And then you learn, like, you can't poop here. Every time you cry, you're not getting the boob anymore. You have to accede to the world in a different way. Children learn through orality, but I feel like the egg and the egg avatar is all about like non-differentiation and celebrating like genital immaturity. Genital maturity also makes us have to confront our mortality. It makes us confront our limits and our bodily limits. When we, you and I have participated in, political movements and leftist spaces, don't you feel like sometimes you're in a room with like a lot of really fragile eggs who can't deal with actual confrontation or contradiction because if they bump up against each other, they think they're going to crack.
Right.
And that's just not a way to relate to the world. The difficulty of the world right now, the challenges that we're facing, the trust that we need to have with regard to communication can't be adjudicated by a bunch of eggs in a room worried about cracking each other. Oh, wow. And you know what? Compared with these eggs, Donald Trump as like angry, happy baby seems to be a relief.
I've heard you use the phrase before, the tyranny of affect. What is the tyranny of affect?
Affect and affect theory has to do with a kind of rationalization of feeling. And the whole question of affect is that it's not, they like to say, the affect theory people, that it's not individual, it's in the room, it's collective, it is infectious, but this, non-individualized, non-communicative, non-irrational feeling is something that seems to justify a certain kind of behavior, justify a certain kind of attitude towards the other, towards objectivity. And so it's to say that we share an affect, but we don't share an objective world that we can describe, which is like the principle of physics, right? But you and I have this feeling, and we're in the vibes world. I do think vibes are important because I think, like, when you look at the austerity of certain kinds of hyper-rational people in my profession, it's really frightening how disconnected they are from affect. But affect is important, but it's not the end-all and be-all of intersubjectivity. It's good to know where I end and you begin. But I feel like in the affect vibe world, it's just like, let's just vibe together. Have you ever seen like Gen Zers talk? They're like this. They just nod. We're doing it right now. I'm making you do it. And there's this like assumed consent or assent to things that actually has no space for skepticism, for mutual recognition, maybe for my rejection of your ideas, but our shared reality says we have to confront certain struggles in the world. We have to confront physics, gravity. We share a physical world. We share an economic world of growing inequality. We share a world where corruption is the name of the game. But we can't name any of these things if we're only vibing. And if I don't have any boundaries with regard to my assent, and I'm afraid to contradict you or dissent from you, because then we will be cut off, our egg-like connection will be broken, then we can't actually reach mutually beneficial conclusions. We can't have collectivity or solidarity if all we have is our vibes and affect.
There's, I guess, the similarity between a few of the things that you mentioned is that these are themes, names, theories within the academy that seem to masquerade as analysis, but actually create a block or create this undifferentiated space. There's a generation of young people, myself included, that were introduced to maybe the secondary and tertiary sources, but never actually got that education of the primary sources, the canon. Most of what we were taught was critiquing or debunking ideas that came before. And I think that goes a long way to explain some of the illiberal beliefs that have emerged in campus politics right now. How do you explain this rise of illiberal beliefs that's happened in the last few years?
I keep going back to this idea of the counterculturalists winning, in the institutions, and they succeeded. They became professors. They were very oppositional. There was a cultural break within the professoriate where this younger generation that were emerging in the 70s were very sure of themselves and their rectitude, because the older generation wore tweed and, suits, and they were wearing jeans and listening to rock and roll. Like, there was a huge cultural break between the great, the silent generation and the boomers sort of taking over academia. And they had a crusading attitude, like, we're not racist, we're against the Vietnam War, we're anti-imperialist. They were maybe led by, their thought leader was Edward Said, Raymond Williams, people who were actually erudite. And then you have this generation of boomer cultural studies people who are like, you know what? We reject the canon. We come in with a political mission, and we are successful in academia. And so we are teaching the new young people a kind of enlightened set of enlightened field of knowledge. And we tell them that you don't have to read the canon anymore because it's heteropatriarchal, normative, and we can explore our feelings about stars. We can explore our relationship to popular culture. There really was a cultural revolution within academia, and in that cultural revolution, there was a fervor that these was increasingly successful cultural studies types were wielding like a red guard. Like you read Shakespeare, you're a reactionary. I'm actually not the biggest Shakespeare fan, but let's say you read Marcel Proust, you like Samuel Beckett, you must be a reactionary because I just watch TV, or I love Survivor. I've written a book about Madonna. I want to read Lost. Like there was an oppositionality and an antagonism that then created, I think, this crusading idea that transmits to younger people. Like, we're in a seminar, but we're actually on a crusade to destroy power. Like, I love the way that people use that. Like, we're dissecting power. That really does come from Foucault. I'm sure you heard about this. And it's like, power is this transhistorical meta thing
That's what I was going to ask, is where do they think it comes from?
Where do they think power comes from?
Yeah.
Normativity.
Okay.
Or where do they think power comes? Like heteropatriarchal norms, the state, organizations. Like this animus against bureaucracy that Trump is exercising really has deep roots in the libertarianism of left and right that realized itself through the past 50 years. So you have to distrust the man. The hippies and don't trust anyone over 30, distrust the man. Like we've created this kind of antagonism that will say everything about power except capital, and will say everything about power's exercise over us except exploitation. For the right, it's like bureaucracy and institutions waste money. For the left liberals who, come out of the Foucauldian school and also hate bureaucracy, bureaucracy is about, standardization, alienation, and discipline.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before the boomer left. There's this politics that emerges around the 1968 generation in which I would argue that left-wing ideas become kind of infused or woven into this kind of libertarianism.
Yeah.
What are some of the origins of that belief system? Because what it seems to have brought now is a kind of left politics that advocates for small business, which seems to be entirely ineffective.
There was a book called Small is Beautiful,
Right.
which was all about this kind of hippie formations of communes versus organizations. It also comes out of, this critique of organizations that actually wasn't business management. The organization man was considered, this guy went to work every day, was a conformist. It was part of the anti-conformity of that boomer left, thinking that, there are oppressive organizations, and then there's this free-flowing small business, small scale, Brooklyn rooftop farming thing that can save the world, right? Just don't join any large organizations. And and the other thing that I'm really fascinated by, and is part of the trauma book too, is that among second wave feminists, the consciousness raising group was so critical and sort of turning discontented housewives into feminists, right? And there was this mythical aha moment where you'd be sharing with your girlfriends and suddenly you're like, aha, that's power. I'm being taught all of these things and I need to liberate myself from my domestic sphere and burn my bra and go out and experiment sexually and emotionally with other people, not my husband or my children. And so this kind of instantaneous feeling of enlightenment is better than the actual hard work of reason upon which the enlightenment is based, which is, maturity, right? So you had second wave feminists telling women it's okay to regress, and because you're gonna free yourself from all these norms. The other thing that was happening in the 70s was this revival of mind cure thought and the New Age. And one of the things that people forget about the New Age and the hippies was that they really were sure that we were transitioning from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius.
The what?
What?
Okay.
The age of Pisces. Okay. The age of Pisces
Keep
was
going.
like a really oppressive age, was the age of Christ and disciplinarity. And sometime in the 60s, end of the 20th century, you look pained. I'm sorry to be telling you this.
Keep going.
But it's you got to know these things, Joshua. But we were changing from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And in the age of Aquarius, it's the age of electricity, of connectivity, and eventually, like, even the internet. And so
I was
then we were all
educated in Marxism, where it's these long, painful, boring equations that just rationally prove the extraction of surplus value. This sounds fucking insane. What are we talking about? We're talking about like constellations, or like
astrology. Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And you know how the calendar goes, like Pisces, Aquarius?
I don't know, actually. I've never cared to learn this stuff. I'm sorry.
December, January is Pisces, and then we move to I don't know, where are we now? Aquarius is like February, and Aquarius is about like loving and communication, and we're going to reach this alternative enlightenment. It's an alternative. Aquarius offers us an alternative to reason, to genital maturity, to even, normative forms of intersubjectivity, because we're just going to all connect. And the I shouldn't say the internet, this new communitarianism that was sort of the structure of the internet at the bottom of the California ideology is all about this instantaneous transformation.
Yeah.
Like no effort necessary for the revolution. It's just going to happen. And, I'm sure that the boomer cultural studies profs would be like, we don't believe in astrology, but this was like, I think their thinking. And when I look at the world that they've given us, there are all these departments that have, in anthropology especially, that have decolonizing the curriculum in them. Like our voluntary, we are so enlightened that we're going to go through the entire mass of human history and also human endeavor and just decolonize things one by one, so that when we click a little button, they'll be enlightened. Like this is colonial thought. We click a button, now it's decolonized. It's voluntarist, it's immediate, and it's gestural and performative in a way that makes us feel better about reading Franz Boas or Margaret Mead. And they had, terrible prejudices and biases. They didn't take anti-bias training, and we're going to, take the bias out of their work. So there's a kind of instantaneity that I'm talking about that's very similar to the culture of the internet. Like all of these things, have intellectual precedence. Like why do we want instantaneity so badly? It was this imagination that was already cultivated and created in the 60s and then the 70s, where you have this coming to you one day, it's like the red pill, black pill thing too. Like all you have to do is take a pill, really. You don't have to like think anything through, and you never have to change your point of view after you've taken the pill.
We've mentioned the Enlightenment a few times. Some of the ideologies that I see rising, coming into prominence in the last few years include theocracy, literally monarchy. People make arguments for things that are analogous to the caste system.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have a left that rejects the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Because it's somehow responsible for racism, colonialism, the tragedies of history, has all of this baggage that comes along with it.
Right.
How should the left understand its relationship to the Enlightenment?
For better or worse, the idea that all human beings are created equal, that reason and scientific method, replicable through experimentation and documented through a kind of mathematical, empirical observation of the world that other people can follow with regard to my logic, this kind of anti-mystical grounding anti-religious, anti-propagandistic, anti-authoritarian idea of a subject who could engage with others in the world through reason, not mysticism, not subjugation. That idea, for better or worse, was hatched in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. There are material reasons for this. The bourgeoisie created enough leisure that there was enough people who were able to engage in philosophical thinking outside of the tutelage of the monarchs and the church. They were able to hide, beginning with Galileo, they were persecuted by the church. And then by the 17th century in France, Descartes was able to sort of give a deist cast to what he was really pioneering, which was the scientific method. And this moment, precipitates the violent overthrow of feudalism in France, and also the violent overthrow of the British Empire in the United States. This idea that all human beings are created equal and that systems of oppression and belief are meant to enslave people in a state of what Kant called permanent tutelage, that we should all be freeing ourselves from this state of tutelage in order to be able to enjoy and participate in human progress and endeavor, which means the emancipation of the majority of human beings from both want, oppression, and exploitation. That begins, for better or worse, as a form of thought in Europe. We can stamp our feet and say, well, there are other forms of enlightenment. There are, what the fuck happened? But the scientific method that gave us electricity, that gave us the buildings, the possibility of building buildings this high, urbanization, along with this ravages, modernity was born in the 17th century in Europe. And there are many reasons we could think about this. That you could say that Protestantism and a certain form of, Jesuitical Catholicism was already on a secularizing trajectory.
Yes.
Right? So the thing now that people are rejecting, I think, is that in actuality, democratic forms and capitalism cannot coexist, and capitalism is eating democracy alive.
Right.
So a lot of young people, like my son, who's only grown up with the dysfunctional democracy, I think I saw the end of it, he'll say, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Democracy doesn't work. This is not working. And they feel attracted to a kind of authoritarianism, because the authoritarianism seems more obvious and naked exercise of power. Whereas, if you have people preaching to you about, let's use our reason together, and there's just all this fucking irrationality going on, especially in the left liberal spheres, then you just think, well, maybe we need to go back to strong top-to-bottom forms of rule, because democracy is just hypocrisy to younger people. It's fallen down. There's nostalgia for authoritarianism. I can understand that. The other thing is, pragmatically speaking, left organizations should be more structured and authoritarian, because we're not going to be just like aggregated little eggs trying to take down the system that we live in, because it doesn't provide. Organization actually provides stability, transmissibility of knowledge. I feel like every time there's a new organizational fervor on the left, we keep repeating the same mistakes, which were already described in that Joe Freeman article called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Yeah. If you haven't read it, you should really read it. And it's about how the women's movement ate itself up in the 1970s, where one day you're working for women's liberation, and the next day you're being canceled by a group of women who think that you're too male identified, or you're not a loyal enough member of the sisterhood. And every single left organization that I've seen comes to this point at some point where it becomes a purity politics. And I think it is the end point of a kind of crypto religiosity. What puts that down is highly, highly structured organizations.
Hmm.
Extremely centralized exercise of power. And then you say, it's a dictatorship. We listen to your complaints, but there's no voting involved. So I think young people are legitimately questioning how democracy can function in a country where capitalism just eats democracy alive. Right now, the fact that Elon Musk has $500 billion at his disposal means that he has a weapon. It's like he has a nuclear weapon, and then the 330 million rest of us have sticks. And this is the thing about caring, is that at some point we have to get out of the humid, sentimental ideas about caring for helpless things and helpless people even, and think about how to build organizations with lasting power that can confront the obscene accumulation of wealth that's taking place today. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think that if you organized a protest now that really was powerful, I'm going to sound too conspiratorial, but the powers that will be, they'll come, that I'll put that down, either through infiltration, through physical threats. So there hasn't been a threatening figure like that since Bernie, and they put him down. They put down that movement really quickly. The other thing about the Enlightenment is that once you have an articulated, reasoned, rational analysis of political economy, of the unconscious, of mental health, of childhood, of eroticism, of exploitation, it's very hard to silence it. Once it's been written, once it's been communicated, if you want to regress to irrationality, you have to fight really hard to repress the truth that is out there. And so, Freud wrote, the voice of reason is quiet, but it will not be silenced. And and I feel like all the irrationality of liberalism is being punished by Trump. You can't be that stupid and irrational and try to fool people as much as they did without some kind of karmic revenge, because there is I think, reason that we all share. This is the Enlightenment speaking. We all have a capacity to reason. We all share it. You can suppress it. You can, become a holy roller. You can join a cult. You can join Curtis Yarvin in his Nostalgia for Monarchy. But we all have a sense of logic. It's innate in human beings. And it will, at some point, explode. It will, at some point, react against irrationality, either violently, effectively, or ineffectively if it's not organized. But this was also such an important point for Marx, for Freud, for Kant, for the thinkers of the Enlightenment, which is that human beings are born equal, not because of who they are, but because of their shared capacity for reason.
Right.
Even the caveman who built, who hunted, or who built something, who tamed domesticated animals, who found tribal organizations that allowed for his clan to survive, or her clan to survive, they had to use reason at some point to become, we as a species had to use our minds at some point to become the top predators of the earth, because we are physically very weak, but we are mentally very strong. And God and tyrants and capitalism would like to take that away from us. But they can't really, because the secret has been broken.
This kind of irrationality that has become, I think, prominent and mainstream on the left, I find this to be in contradiction with overcoming the market form of organization in society, that if one was to go about, let's say, economic planning or even high-speed rail, something like this, that would be a very deliberate, rational approach. And having lost that, I think we've kind of lost trace of this lineage. This is why I wanted to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment today, because Marx is scaffolded on top of the shoulders and the insights of Adam Smith, and Adam Smith before him, there is this school of thought called the Enlightenment. Where did the American left go wrong? Is this something that happened in the 90s? Is it something that happened in 1968, 1917? Did it happen in the 1700s? Where do we start to scope this problem?
When did the left start to worship irrationality? I think that's a good question.
Yeah.
And I think that the secularizing drive of both Freud and Marx to depose all gods and potentates and irrationality, that got stopped, I think, with the New Left, who began to worship irrationality as a form of oppositionality.
And when we say the New Left, what period are we
At
referring
the
to?
SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, becoming like more New Age, like 68 to 72.
Right.
But the other thing that's interesting about this moment is that it actually comes at a moment when there's massive redistribution of wealth from the top down.
Mm.
And there's a kind of middle class comfort that Americans haven't enjoyed before. And it's at this moment of like actual social democratic triumph that both capital needs to increase its rate of profit, and deindustrialization of the United States begins, and the outsourcing of heavy manufacturing to East Asia begins, and wealth starts to be redistributed back up through the 70s. But there's this kind of optimism, I would say, that and hubris that the New Left had, because it sort of assumed that there would be a stable middle working class alliance, and that was broken completely by Reagan, which also leads to the confirmation of this left theory that social democracy itself is not stable.
Yes.
Right? Like, Social Security is a social democratic institution that the right wing right now wants to eat alive.
They're trying
and
to
privatize, right? So it's a social democratic thing. And so if you really think about it, then it was always unstable, because they were mad. The right was mad when it was established, and they've been like salivating over this large sum of money that we pay into so that we don't have to die in poorhouses. And they're thinking like, how this is just sitting there. Elon Musk called it a Ponzi scheme, which is either deliberate obfuscation or just like sheer stupidity.
I think it was a policy paper from the Cato Institute or something like that.
He's repeating.
Yeah. Yes, social democracy is unsustainable in the long term, right? So there's this kind of problem with historical development where there's large profit margins at the beginning. You can redistribute this wealth into universal basic policies, social democratic infrastructure. And then after a certain point of development, necessarily austerity has to cut in and capital fights back against labor. And this is historically the problem of social democracy, that it kind of works for a limited period of time. That crisis of social democracy can kind of break in two directions. Either it can move towards neoliberal austerity, as it did in 1972 to 1980, or it can move towards economic planning, where you no longer need to use this price mechanism to organize society's resources. And so as we are encountering another period in which there may be certain forms of social democracy that happen in the advanced world, like I've heard it referred to as a green national security Keynesianism, this kind of resurgence of not quite New Deal politics, but things that more so resemble the New Deal liberalism that we were akin to before, the neoliberal period, that again, these opportunities to introduce forms of economic planning become possible.
Right.
Good luck telling that to anybody who was raised on the canon of 1968, though. There's this censorious trend that's kind of emerged in the last few years. Where do you attribute that to? Is that something that came out of the boomer generation, or
on the liberal side?
On the liberal left, yeah, particularly among elite educated professionals, among the college campus left? Is that something that happened in the 90s? Is it the 60s, or where does that start?
I don't know where it started, but to me it's very crypto-religious. It's all about excommunication. There's a doctrine, and the more powerful they became within liberal institutions, the more doctrinal error was not tolerated. So there are doctrines that have to do with like visibility, recognizability, centering marginalized voices, even though, we don't have, or land acknowledgments, or this mystical idea of identity giving you some kind of moral superiority over other people, that they really underwrote. And I feel like they're the doctrinal deviations from identity politics or wokeness, if you like, maybe even through recourse to a historical high liberalism, not to mention Marxism, that is just not tolerated.
Right.
This kind of intolerance is part and parcel of what I was going to say is their power. It's like they've consolidated so much power and they don't want to give up any of that power, even though skepticism was always, I think, a, kind of prime principle of liberalism. Like, I'm not going to take what you say at face value. I'm going to be skeptical. We'll argue about it. I trust that you won't lie to me, and I trust that you won't hate me if I disagree with you. But somehow, because we can't have universalism because of postmodern pluralism, we don't even believe in God. So all we believe in is doctrinal purity.
Yeah.
You know what leftists need to do? They need to grow up and have boundaries. And I am going to be like the Joni Peterson right now.
Okay.
It is not okay to be a little egg avatar. We have to treat ourselves and each other like adults, which means sometimes we'll be upset by the world. We will be upset by other people's opinions, other people's behaviors, and we have to treat ourselves and the other with respect, because we have to keep the idea of good social relations before we can even get to socialism. And good social relations means good boundaries. And this is why having a strong ego is actually critical to being a good political subject. Otherwise, you're divided like an egg between the superego and the id. Freud said the superego and the id are on one loop. The ego has to be a mediating term between them. So people, grow the fuck up.
Speaking of MAGA communism, we're in a situation where historic margins of working class people have voted for Republicans. This is something that's been growing over the last few years, but it's impossible to ignore now, even for the mainstream media. You mentioned before this kind of left liberal doctrine. It seems to resemble something of like a priest class. Our mutual friend Angela Nagel described some of this increasing margin of working class support for conservative right-wing populist parties as a kind of clerical rebellion. Does that analogy map to you? Does that make sense?
It does. But I don't know if it's clerical rebellion or popular blasphemy.
What's the difference between the two?
The clerical rebellion means like there's one part of the church that rebels against another part of the church. And I feel like the Republican Party is not really like, it's not devout or pious enough with liberal values. It just wants to encourage popular blasphemy. But I think it's important. I was like, this is a distraction. But right now, I think it's part of this irrationality. Of course, trans people should have civil rights, but why can't we call people mothers? Why, when my girlfriend was giving birth or going to birthing classes, prenatal education classes, they had to call mothers birthing people. This is in Brooklyn 3 years ago. How did it get to that point where we couldn't use the word mother anymore? Didn't we think there would be a popular reaction against that bullshit? And it was totally doctrinal. And my friend said, she talked to some of these doulas and these natal education people, and they were afraid of being canceled because they have, a presence online. That's how they get their business, midwives and stuff like that. So they were conforming to the liberal doctrine of Brooklyn that you couldn't actually say early childhood education for mothers or, birthing classes for mothers. It had to be birthing classes for birthing people.
How do we explain this historic margin of working class people voting for Republicans? How much of that is
this stuff.
Culture wars, trans kids, like all of this kind of stuff? And how much of it is this kind of underlying crisis of, let's say, the Democrats abandoning labor as part of their coalition? What proportionally makes up this historic shift?
So let's say we wanted to do we double down as liberals on identity politics, but we also fought for universal health care. We also fought for the breakup of monopolies. We also fought for minimum wage. Let's say we fought for both things with equal amounts of fervor, and we actually gave people concrete benefits that made them trust their government or their political policies, their political policies. Maybe that would have been okay. But the Dems pushed the language rituals without really having any stake in providing for working class and middle class people. Trump actually just wrote checks at the end of COVID. Biden stopped that. And there were certain things that people kept saying, like, his Inflation Reduction Act did so much. They just had bad optics, bad communication. They should have told people how they were improving their lives. Maybe they actually weren't improving their lives. Maybe it wasn't just a PR stunt. But they pushed this other cultural program harder than they did the economic programs.
Yeah.
You know what I was thinking on my way over here? I was like, look at all these executive orders that Trump was doing. What if a Democratic president actually said, we're going to abolish insurance companies? They didn't do anything. We're going to have single payer. I'm going to do it by executive order. Because here's a $1 billion company that's did not, the CEO of a United Healthcare would still be alive. Luigi wouldn't have had to do what he had to do. And we'd have just said, no insurance companies. Executive order.
Yeah.
And we would have gotten all this pushback, but you'd have been saying, I'm on the side of Americans who've been exploited by their insurance companies. Why? And I want mothers to be called birthing people, which I would have still objected to, but it was like, I'm going to do this really powerful thing and take away this middleman that's adjudicating your health care for profit. There's so many doctors that are angry about this, so many nurses that are angry about this, so many people who suffered like this. Who would be angry at you for punishing insurance companies? But they won't do it because their billionaire donors don't want them to. So they're just like puppets of a different kind of oligarch. Because I was really thinking about that. Like, what kind of symbolic executive order could a Democratic president have made that would have galvanized people, even if eventually got whittled away and challenged in the courts, whatever? What if you just said, you know what, United Healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, you guys are no good. You're bad people. Talk like Trump. You're hurting people. You're horrible. You're doing crimes against America. I'm getting rid of you. And then everyone would be like, oh, no. But no, these guys are bad guys. The insurance companies are bad guys. You'd have at least 100 million Americans going, yes, you're on my side. And you're like, I'm on your side, people. These are bad guys. In an alternate universe, I see Luigi Mangione coming down the street, gunning someone down. Someone's going to get really mad at these insurance CEOs. What value do they provide? None. So let's just get rid of them.
On this topic of executive orders, this has been recently my hobby horse to discuss with people during Trump 2.0. There's a lot of criticisms on the left about this concentration of power in the executive branch, people calling Trump a dictator and so on. And I think to myself that, let's imagine some point in the future there's a candidate that you and I like, and we want them to pass sweeping policy reforms. We actually do want a very empowered executive branch that can do FDR-like transformations to the U.S. Is there something that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot with some of these critiques, this fear of power, fear of actually transforming the stuff of society?
I'm not shooting myself in the foot because I'm for that.
we on the left, I think generally, I think you and I would probably disagree with this, but I hear these criticisms kind of bubbling up in the zeitgeist.
Everything is so procedural, right? They're so technocratic. He's not following the rules. I think that for...
He's not following the rules, yeah.
Exactly.
The rules that are written on paper, right? Is that okay?
He's just doing stuff. So this goes back to, I think, our idea to one of your questions about how democracy for younger people seems like it's a failed experiment, is that it's become completely processual. Like, it's all process-based.
Yeah.
It's not politics.
Mm-hmm.
This is how David Plouffe and Quentin Folks talked about the failure of the Harris campaign too. It was all like technical. Their failures were technical, not political. Like actually an executive order and a sovereign act on the part of the president is highly political. Like he's doing things and he's changing the political realm. He's changing what we imagine possible through government. He's making people angry, making some people happy, and he feels that he is the expression of the popular will.
Yeah.
Because he won so many votes. Why did no Democratic president feel that way? Democratic presidents think they're the managers of constitutional procedure. But you know what? Actually, you could think of executive power as the expression of popular will. And now that all of Trump's executive orders are going to be challenged in courts, his followers are going to say, those judges were appointed, they were not elected, like that, the courts are actually anti-democratic. But I feel like we right now have to push the limits of what executive power is for Trump to execute the will of the oligarchs. If one day we do get a progressive leader, someone's going to have to do that to thwart the will of the oligarchs.
Right.
But you cannot continue to be technocratic and depoliticizing and apolitical. One of the things that the Democrats are really good at doing is making people feel hopeless and demobilizing them politically.
I will not include this in the public version of the podcast, but my contrarian impulse here is that if one had to imagine organizing a national economy that contained 1,000 millionaires versus 10 billionaires, there are procedures, there are levers that can be used over a small group of people, like Jack Ma, for example. Like if we have the neo FDR that gets into office, like we just put Elon Musk in prison for like 10 years. And you don't have to worry about taxing, 900 other people that are routing their capital through the Cayman Islands and using tax avoidance and whatever. It's just concentrated in one guy. That's a little bit of a lever there.
You're not going to put the. Well, I'll say that I totally agree with you.
It's a little too based, maybe, for the
public
version.
But I'll agree with you on this because I'd
put him in jail now. I wouldn't wait, but once we do have neo FDR, immediately, overnight.
And you know what? The other thing is, Jack Ma was never in jail. He was just sequestered. This is what, because there's no habeas.
It's that easy.
There's no habeas corpus in China, or we don't need habeas on
yeah.
But he was just probably under house arrest and not told not to make public appearances for a while. So the thing that I thought was really interesting about this was that seeing what's happening now is that instead of having Jack Ma bride the Chinese government scared the billionaires, as you said.
Right.
And now we have the billionaires exercising their will, or one billionaire at least. The others are scared, but exercising his will over Trump and collaborating with him. And in China, it's antagonistic. It's like, and the government said, we let you make all this money. But in the end, we're still in charge of you. And you know what's crazy about that is that if you look at Chinese public opinion, they're like, yeah, you know what? He had too much money.
Yeah. No, it's
they're not like,
no, good.
Jack
Ma,
he should be free. There was a lot of skepticism, like, well, I think he didn't pay his taxes that year. There was public criticism of him.
I don't think
there wasn't
Elon
this
Musk did
adulation.
either, come to think of it. Huh. I don't think Elon Musk did either.
Yeah, exactly. There wasn't public adulation. Like he's a multi-billionaire. We really admire him. Oh, poor guy. His civil rights. There was maybe he did something.
Yeah. Or at least his civil rights comes at the cost of everyone else's life expectancy because he's got all the resources. Yeah. Let's talk about social media for a moment. There's the kind of theory or political common sense that has emerged that people will refer to as this mass, leaderless, disorganized protest. Where did some of these ideas come from? Why does this seem like a plausible, common sense idea to many of today's left?
The academic sources are, of course, anarchists like David Graeber, neo-populist anti-Marxists like Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, who kind of moved away from old left forms of protests and strikes into talking about these kinds of electric, spontaneous organizations from popular discontent. They had a whole argument against organization because organization would naturally become oppressive. You would have a hierarchy of demands, whereas these populist uprisings, they were Argentinian, could create a chain of demands that would be non-hierarchical. And I think, I'm not that familiar with David Graeber, but, for me, he's part of the school of also the no logo, Naomi Klein types, which are just like, we protest the WTO and consumerism.
Right.
And that in and of itself is a kind of oppositionality that will attract more and more people and that will make global multinationals afraid of us. I think that Graeber was talking about also, anthropological formations where pre-modern organizations that could have been very effective. That kind of strong institutionalization of anarchic thinking as anti-authoritarianism.
I have great admiration for Graeber's work, but I feel like very often people are afraid to say this, but like, how are those forms of organization standing up to power right now?
Once again, it's like overlooking the rationalization that the Enlightenment took with regard to organizations and corporations and financialization and the organization of modes of production. In pre-modern forms of modes of production, you could have maybe this kind of more floating, mobile organization. But once again, you can admire them without worshiping them. So in 2011, Occupy was everywhere. People had lost their homes. There were young anarchists and old grandmas who were occupying the piece of lawn in front of city council. And I had a 10-year-old. I didn't have a lot of time. I went to Occupy UCI meetings. There was a 5-hour meeting that determined that we could not call it Occupy UCI because that was like occupying the occupied territories. They rebranded it as Take Back UCI. So I felt,
what else were the item menus for the 5-hour meeting?
No, this
Did you
took
do
a
anything
long
else?
time. No, nothing else. This took a long time to debate. But there were many, many meetings, and there was an occupation. For a long time, there was resistance against placing a list of demands in the hands of the administration. And finally, after really a lot of struggle and my arguing with them and arguing against my colleagues who are part of this anarchic thing where they said, if you have demands, then you're just giving power to the administration. So I was like, so what are we occupying? What's the protest? What's the end of the protest? Showing power by just having, all those tents in the center of the campus. So after, a couple of weeks of this, the students realized they needed to have a list of demands, and they came up with a list of non-prioritized demands that had to do with freezing the tuition, showing more transparency in the budgeting.
I can't even prioritize the demands.
Yeah, they can't prioritize.
I'm sorry,
but listen,
okay.
But listen to it. So listen, it gets worse. So, one of the demands was gender-neutral bathrooms. So they delivered the demands to President Drake, was like chair of the faculty senate, and he was at the meeting when Drake looked at the demands, laughed, and said, I'll give them gender-neutral bathrooms. So it was really funny.
Tuition's going up, but you got...
He literally laughed at the list of non-prioritized
you could actually you don't have to build another one. You can just change the sign. So the tuition hike will probably cover it.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And this was at a time also when the faculty had to take a 4 to 10% pay cut because the situation was so dire. There was so much possibility for galvanizing public opinion. The students were suffering. The faculty and staff were suffering. We were all suffering. Classes were being canceled. The budgets were frozen. But, there were these 5-hour meetings about demands. And, somehow I still remained hopeful.
What is the role of culture in political struggle? people will ask, what is PMC? What is PMC? I see this a few times a week. Maybe it would be worth the time now to talk a little bit about the history of that term, about Barbara and John Ehrenreich. Who are they? Where does this story begin?
So, Barbara and John Ehrenreich published an essay called The Professional Managerial Class in 1977 in a journal which looks more like a zine. It's online. It's called Radical America.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. There's a little essay in there about hairdressing salons as working class women's spaces. So you get a picture of like American radicalism in the late 70s even, which is so lively, and so deeply connected with working class life worlds. And in this essay, they said that left liberal or political spaces, you want to call it that, are increasingly dominated by credentialed white collar elites.
Right.
And their vision of politics, and that this kind of organic relationship to working class interests that the Democratic Party once could represent through its sort of big tent inclusion of union leaders and union workers has been broken by this monopolization of liberalism by credentialed elites. Recently, there's an article in Jacobin by Chris Maizano saying that most of the American workforce is white collar now, and that is either service worker, white collar, college educated, or and that the industrial blue collar working class is just disappearing in America, and we should just embrace the progressive politics of this new class. It's called new class, white collar workers, and these white collar workers like identity politics, and we can't think that bread and butter issues are going to be some kind of like messiah.
That sounds wrong in like 12 different ways.
So crazy, you have to read it. It just came out like 48 hours ago.
Do I have to read it, actually?
It's so confusing. Maybe you don't have to read it just because it's so confusing and contradictory. But as a kind of apologia for Democratic Party politics, it might be useful to read it.
Oh, I see.
So what they say is that we have dominantly mobile white-collar elites, but they like identity politics too. These people like identity politics. And so what I take from this is new statistical readings of the changing nature of the American workforce. I mean, in a lot of the statistics that I cite, we have out-of-wage workers, 25% are professional managerial workers. And their numbers, because they look at professionals, they check out the managerial qualities, like that group, the professional white collar and service worker, they include the service worker, they include nurses, they're expanding to 40 to 60%. And, agricultural workers now make up only 3%. The industrial working class is, really shrinking as well, so that what Maizano's argument against the Ehrenreichs would be, well, there is no blue-collar industrial working class now with its values and with its bread-and-butter issues. We have to just massage Democratic Party politics to combine some bread-and-butter issues, but with progressive identity politics as basically like the Democratic Party doesn't have to change. You just keep going. Keep going. But historically speaking, what I think is really interesting about the manager and the foreman in the factory under industrial capitalism, and then the white-collar worker, the MBA, in the later part of the 20th century, is that in the family firm, I think Marx talks about this, in the late 19th century, the clerk, who are the accountant, like all the clerks and the people who work to manage the finances of a large family firm, let's like ThyssenKrupp in Germany, right? The people who were working to manage those resources were almost like family servants. Like I said, they often worked, very closely with the head of the family. Sometimes they even worked in the family home. That family home becomes like the office. But as corporations become more complex, this layer of people needs special training. Their numbers expand. Some of them, like under Taylorism, are taken up by from the best workers and promoted through the ranks. And then we have specializations in college in management to expand this notion of accounting, of worker discipline, and I would say today, like financialization, speculation, and liability. So lawyers, accountants, managers expand within this group. And you have this idea that they are mediating between lower tier wage workers and the owners of capital,
Right.
the bosses, right? So this class is expanding in number, does expand as capitalism becomes more complex, and its values are the values of the capitalist, but with a progressive and liberal veneer, because it also has to mediate the interests of the wage workers below it. But more and more, I find, and the Ehrenreichs, see it in the 70s, is that they are protecting only the interests of capital while trying to differentiate themselves from lower tier wage workers. When this class was smaller and worker unrest was more dangerous, you have someone like John Dewey, you have Edward A. Ross, the early professoriate, when only 5.5% of the American population went to college in 1900. They tried to standardize and regularize and protect academic freedom from the ravages of the market and from the demands of the bosses. And this was a moment when the nascent professional classes were probably the most progressive at all. But you could also say, from a purely historical materials point of view, that they were only mediating and stabilizing the immediate unrest and crises of capital. So you could say that they just stabilized capital so that there was no revolution in 1896, and they prolonged its life in some way. But I also think that someone like Jane Addams wasn't formally recognized, formally educated, but was a pioneer of social work. She actually did improve the lives of Chicago tenement immigrants. In terms of these social science instruments that we take for granted today, like taking surveys in the tenements, elite Victorian ladies did not even want to go into these fetid areas and thought that they were just crime and disease-ridden. And when you go and look at the Jane Addams Museum in Chicago today, it's like standing all alone because everything else around it was demolished and turned into freeways. But someone had this idea that maybe we should preserve this house. There are really incredible maps of neighborhoods, languages spoken, rates of disease, childbirth, deaths, and maternity death rates, and they're all on paper. They're all archived. And so her purpose for that was to improve social services for the Chicago slums. But, today, all of these surveys that social science and social workers have inherited as part of the professional managerial class is about managing resources, managing austerity,
right,
for the poor, the underprivileged, et cetera. Her contact was being in the community with them. But now we instrumentalize poverty knowledge to create more studies, more grants, more surveys in the university. There's actually a book called Poverty Knowledge by Sarah O'Connor, but there's also another book called Automating Inequality, which is about how data gathering and data valence was first exercised on a massive scale through welfare. So the professional managerial class we could say manages inequality today, manages workers for the interest of capital, private equity, if you like. People have specialized interests and abilities which allow them to do jobs that differentiate themselves from unskilled wage workers. I have to say, though, that I have had so many letters from lawyers, doctors, medical ethics trainers, people who are working large organizations, who are part of the professional elite, who have seen how our stratum has totally betrayed the public good.
Right.
People just write me from all over, ever since Virtue Hoarders came out. And they'll say, I can't say this out loud. No one is going to listen to me, or thank you for writing this book. I feel less alone. People are oh, PMC, you're just a self-hating PMC. No, it's called being self-critical. I like having professional knowledge. I think expertise is important. But we're seeing how within the management of healthcare, for instance, healthcare is not managed for the knowledge, for the well-being of patients or to respect the expertise of doctors. It's for profit of the insurance companies.
In 2013, there's an important essay by Barbara and John Ehrenreich called The Death of a Yuppie Dream, The Rise and Fall of the Professional Managerial Class.
Yeah.
Do you understand the PMC as expanding or shrinking, or where do you see their role in society? Are they growing in power now?
So that essay, I have to say, I disagreed with their conclusions, but it was written like right on the heels of Occupy Wall Street.
Right.
So there were a lot of downwardly mobile PMC people who were or college-educated people who wanted to be PMC who were in the encampments, and they were very optimistic about the fact that there would be a new coalition between different strata of wage workers to rebel against capital.
Right.
I think that as capital shrank well-paying jobs, well-paying white-collar jobs, the PMC's role as a gatekeeper into that world became more and more important. The sort of narrow door from like college degree to elite job becomes smaller and smaller,
Right.
and its gatekeeping function actually made it more powerful. And I think that what they underestimated was how powerful that gatekeeping function would be.
Yeah.
And how disorganized the left was, and how this kind of anarcho-libertarianism within Occupy Wall Street would turn into kind of crypto-religious cancel culture. Like they didn't really experience that. I mean, Barbara Ehrenreich passed away a few years ago, R.I.P. She was canceled. You know that because she
What'd she do?
She was canceled online, when she was in her late 70s by a bunch of young social justice warriors because she said something about how Maria Hondo, the declutterer, she said, it's amazing that America has one of its most popular social media influencers doesn't even speak English, because this was the height of Maria Hondo's decluttering social media empire. And for some reason, everyone thought that was really racist, that she mentioned that this Japanese woman didn't speak English.
Does she speak English? I
No,
haven't
it's
really
all
seen the show.
subtitled, I think. It's all subtitled.
Oh, so she just literally doesn't speak English?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they thought it was cultural appropriation. This was one of the most awful points. And I remember thinking, what have any of you done for the American left? This woman is a monument to the American left in American left intellectual history, and she puts out. She was on, Ehrenreich was on Twitter. She was like a woman of the people, and she was just commenting on popular culture, and we had that kind of racialist jihad going on, and even mentioning this meant that she had to have a fatwa put on her. I don't know what she made of it, Ehrenreich herself, but it was kind of like her 1977 article come to ironic fruition, that the values of this class would be so divorced from many material issues that it would only police people on the level of language and ritual.
Right.
And so when she and John Ehrenreich wrote this in 1977, she was much more prescient than 2013, when I think she and John wanted to believe that the revolution was coming again.
They were quite optimistic about it.
77 was, sort of the death of 68 revolution, but 2013, after Occupy Wall Street, was them trying to be optimistic about organized protest.
There's definitely a Jordan Peterson clean your room joke in here somewhere, but I'm not going to make it.
But there was something that Maria Hondo did that was really funny, where you have to take all your possessions, put them in your hand, and ask yourself, does this give me joy? And if it doesn't, you throw it away. Remember that?
Yeah. No, I do now. Yeah. On this topic of the clerisy, the priest class, there's another term that people will throw around recently called the Brahmin left. What does the Brahmin left describe? What are we trying to get at here?
Piketty is French, and he's really talking about this.
Thomas Piketty is the author responsible for the Brahmin left.
Economist, who says that he's not a Marxist, but wrote incredible books about capital in the 21st century. And his thesis about the Brahmin left is that there's a certain kind of leftist who's not only wealthy, but has all the social and cultural capital and tries to exercise their idea of cultural and economic politics as a dominant ideology in their countries. But what I was going to say was that his analysis was based on the French, like, left bank leftists.
Just very quickly, the analogy he's making here to the Brahmin caste, should we define that for the audience if they're not familiar?
So India is a caste country where Hinduism religiously justifies a certain division of the population through a caste system that has a divine sanction. And the Brahmins are an upper caste group of people who are not supposed to touch certain kinds of labor and certain kinds of people. And so at the bottom of the social hierarchy are the Dalits, who were literally called the untouchables, right, in the caste system. And at the top of the social system are Brahmins, who rule the country, get educated, but who also have certain restrictions on their activities that might constrain them. And this caste system is part of a kind of Hindu feudalism that is unmovable because it's divine. And when you have a Brahmin left, one of the things that you could say is that it's a contradiction in terms, because leftism is about dynamism. Classes can come, classes fight, one class can take another place in kind of a hegemonic role in society, and Marx's whole idea of class struggle is about the violence and dynamism of class formation. Once you use those two words together, you use this notion of a fixed, perpetual, divinely sanctioned class of people who are different from others and superior to them, and you combine it with kind of secular leftism that shouldn't embrace a caste system at all, but certainly has its lifestyle and its geographical and educational locations. Is much worse in France because as Piketty showed, like the greatest number of wealthy people in France inherit their wealth. Tax records in France were very, very well kept. So he showed that the accumulation of capital actually happens over generations. Social and cultural and economic capital are concentrated in geographical areas in Paris in a very small number of educational institutions. Sciences politiques, École nationale d'administration, UNA, École des hautes études. And you have to go to these schools and you become the ruling elite. You don't go to these schools, you don't enter government, you don't enter any of the socially desirable circles in this very, very centralized notion. And so it's been translated into thinking about America. We have, our class system is not quite as rigid as the French one, but it's still about a class that believes that it is superior to all other people because of some kind of inherent, let's say, not inherited, but inherent qualities.
So you're in town to talk at PS1, the art museum. We're going to explore this issue of care and why it's so popular among cultural institutions in the last few years. Where can people find your work if they want to learn more about these topics?
So the talk that I'm giving at PS1 is based upon this book that will be published by Verso next spring called Traumatized. And it is about sort of the psychological underpinnings of liberal ideology through a historical treatment of trauma and trauma culture since the 1970s, let's say. Second wave feminism, anti-war, going into deconstruction, psychoanalysis in academia. It will be very exciting and controversial, I hope. I also have a Substack if you want to see just more day-to-day things about what I'm doing called Cluanon, CLIU, anon.substack.com, where I fight against infantilization, and I do bits on culture and film, and I write more about art there than politics. But one of the things I really want to do as part of the Substack in the future when I get things more organized is have a weekly video called user-friendly superego, where I address the psychological problems of living under oligarchical capitalism.
Well, that'll keep you busy.
Yeah, it will. It will.
I think people can lose track of how satisfying good culture writing is because the political analysis is a necessary part of it. So I'm an immense fan of your writing. I encourage people to subscribe to your Substack. Huge fan of your books, and our conversations are always very meaningful. So, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.